and provide for their families. And I'm just interested in hearing from you, Mr. Chairman, what do you think permanence means for the average American worker? You know, so they don't really they look at the tax code, it's so complicated. If we can just explain permanence, because they haven't seen it for so many years. You say 15,000 additions, tax extenders, and all this other stuff going on. What does that really mean for the American people, do you think?
I think it would depend on the economic status of each of the Americans. The more that an American has to rely or depend upon special provisions in the code and watch them change, it's very, very bad. Because to me, you should be able to plan your life without having dramatic changes occur that are going to change everything for you, and you can't anticipate it. So it depends on the condition of the individual as to the impact. But Congressman Reichert, one thing I intended to say in my remarks, which I ran over and I did not get to do, is that the real failing, the major failing of the effort in '86 was the fact that there were major changes that were retroactive. And if I were to give you one caution, do not include any retroactive provision in your tax reform. The retroactivity, and it's one of the major reasons that I led the opposition to the '86 Tax Reform Act, undermined the value of real estate in the country and brought about the demise of thousands and thousands of savings and loans, which cost the federal government well over $125 billion to correct. And that was avoidable if you simply make your changes prospective.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stout, quickly, Mr. Kind and I have included a related provision in our Small Business Add Values for Employees Act, in referring to your testimony, the SAVE Act. How could allowing private employees pool together to provide multiple employer private sector 401ks benefit both American workers seeking retirement security and small business owners hoping to provide this for their workers?
Thank you. I think that pooling unrelated employers would help tremendously with the coverage issues that we have. I work around the Baltimore, D.C. area and work with lots of small employers, and they don't have the administrative staff to be able to handle the complexity that happens when you go to put a plan in place. So pooling these plans together gives them the economies of scale to have lower costs, so their working employees will have access to a plan, number one, but also a plan that is reasonably priced, because you can pool these unrelated employers together. And I think it would make a big impact to the coverage issue we have.
Thank you. Are you back?
Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of our witnesses. Let me say to Chairman Archer, first, I agree with you completely about retroactive provisions, and it's unfortunate we had some included in the first tax bill we considered this year. While you and I may differ on some aspects of tax policy, I also want to take this opportunity to thank you for your leadership in creating the Archer Fellowships at the University of Texas. There's hardly a semester that goes by that I don't have one of those young people in my office, and I know colleagues of both political parties and a number of governmental entities and nonprofit organizations have them here, and it's a great contribution to us and to each of those young people to be able to get engaged in public service. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that commendation. We're very proud of the Archer Fellows, and one of them is actually sitting in the back of the room behind the members today.
Great. Thank you. The importance of today's hearing should not be understated. We have gone some 13 months without any hearing anywhere in America, to my knowledge, on the impact of the proposed Republican tax reform on individual taxpayers. And there's a great deal that needs to be explored about that. We're about to leave in a few days until sometime after Labor Day, and in theory, we're about to have a tax reform bill that, as the chairman indicates, could have far-reaching implications for individual taxpayers. I believe we need a thorough consideration of it with a wide range of opinion. I'm disappointed that the testimony of Seth Hanlon from the Center for American Progress, like a witness that I offered last week, was rejected for this hearing. I think we need to be hearing more, not less. And Ms. Stout, I think your testimony is a good example of that. Just the issue of retirement. You are the first person to testify this year before this committee concerning retirement plans. We know that there are millions of our neighbors across America who do not have adequate savings for their retirement. And looking at how our tax code impacts that and what changes we need to make, I think is very important. You've offered valuable perspective, but we could devote one or more hearings just to exploring that question. And frankly, after looking at the Republican blueprint, I'm not sure exactly what is being proposed on retirement. And I think that there are many people within the industry and the financial services industry that aren't sure either and have voiced some concern about the changes that may be contemplated by the very vague language of that provision. I would say the reason to look at retirement plans is also it's a significant reason because of what we learn about the way these systems are working today. 60% of American households get 16% of the tax benefits today on retirement plans. And the 20% top income earners get 66% of the retirement tax incentive benefits. So we have a system in which many working families are not adequately prepared for retirement. They have only a Social Security check and modest savings and maybe some ownership interest, some equity in their home. And we need to look at retirement savings in terms of how we will reach out and support more, how we can, as you said, involve more small businesses in being able to offer plans for their owners and their employees, and how this measure affects those individuals is very important. Mr. Rodriguez, I would ask you to comment about some of the challenges working families have in saving for retirement and to comment on what the impact on working families would be if we adopt another huge Bush-type tax cut that's not paid for.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. It's a big problem, certainly with low-income populations where retirement savings opportunities at work just aren't there. And as you said, it's absolutely right. The tax code incentivizes the most retirement savings for those already doing it. And I think we've got to find more ways to incentivize those at the lower end, those who are becoming more mobile, to be able to save for retirement. So moving around the incentives, and as you were saying, is going to be an important fix. It's part of the reason why we have such an enormous and growing wealth gap across the country, is because of the way that the tax code incentivizes savings primarily accruing at the top versus in other areas. Now, we do have some great concerns about Rothification. I think we should proceed with some caution on that as we look at the entirety of the package, in part because those could be exploding tax expenditures in the out years that really squeeze our budgets in ways that would make funding and revenue really inadequate for the things we care about.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Ms. Nome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing today. Too often in the news we hear about multinational, international companies, and we know that all of these companies have tax departments that help them pay their taxes and figure out exactly what they owe. But in reality, most of this complexity falls on hardworking taxpayers, people who struggle to pay their taxes correctly and try to navigate it around the kitchen table and get through the process and do it sometimes with the help of a CPA or a tax preparer, but sometimes they don't have that advantage. We would all agree that everyone needs to pay what is owed, but the current tax code robs people of their most precious commodity, and that's their time. And so I'd like to focus on that a little bit today. Time could be better spent with their families, making their business more productive, investing in new opportunities, local community groups. I talked to one CPA in South Dakota who told me this. He said, as a certified public accountant with 33 years of experience, I've watched the tax code become more complex, making it both costly and difficult to comply with. At the same time, the quality of customer service within the IRS has fallen. As a result, I see within my practice and clients a decreasing confidence in the tax system as a whole. Tax reform gives us the opportunity to address these matters, to ease frustrations, and to restore faith and confidence in our tax systems. So we need tax reform, not just for American businesses, but more importantly for American families and individuals who are struggling with the burden that it places on them every day. Chairman Archer, I'd like to visit with you a little bit. I want to thank you, first of all, for being here and making it a priority, and then all of your years of service as well. But I wanted to ask you what you've seen over the years in an erosion in American confidence in the tax system. But then I want to focus in particular about your perspective on permanence in the tax code, because we have people propose to us constantly, and you've dealt with it over the years, of tax extenders, or putting tax policy in place for a short period of time. And what a disservice that does to a business or a family trying to plan for the future. Could you speak a little bit with your background knowledge about the importance of having permanence in the tax code when we look at reforms?
Well, I'm a strong believer in permanence, but I'm that way in everything in my life. I like things to be in a position and know that I can come back 5 years later and they'll still be there. That is not life, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's not the way things work. But there's no reason why the tax code cannot be one that is not forever changing, because things are expiring. There are changes that will happen, and taxes will have to be changed at some point. We know that. That's a certainty in life, but not one where every time you put something in, you've got to say for revenue purposes, it's going to expire at a certain time, and therefore we're going to change the revenue effects.
You know, I think you make a valid point there, because I've spent my life farming and ranching. And so we've seen in different policies, and when it's come to energy, short-term tax policies to maybe get an industry off the ground or something to get it started, knowing it's going to sunset when it gets its feet under it. I think we do see that at a period of time. But also I know from starting a business from scratch, from running a hunting lodge that I started from nothing, and running a family restaurant and running an insurance agency too, that if I'm going to go to the bank and ask for a loan, they're going to want to know what my liabilities are going to be and what my business plan is. It's hard to do that unless you've got a permanent tax code. So there's a role maybe for both in different parts of the tax code. Is that maybe the point that you are making, that there is a role in certain times?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And in addition, it seems to me that taxes need to be as simple as possible. And I know that from doing my own tax return. I think your idea of trying to use a postcard for, I'm not sure I would ever qualify to do that, but for the majority of Americans, if they could fill out on a postcard and send it in and say that's going to be it, that has a very attractive appeal. But whether you can do that, I don't know, because that means you've got to eliminate an awful lot of deductions. Mm-hmm. What I worried about from the beginning of my chairmanship of the committee was having a tax code that tried to do everything itself for the American people. I think tax credits are not good. And the idea that, well, we can make things happen in our society by giving a tax credit, I don't agree with that. And I think that complicates the code and makes it difficult for the American people to understand it.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm a little bit disappointed that it took more than half a year before we finally had our first hearing on how tax reform would impact families and individuals, but I'm glad that that day has arrived and we are here. It's impossible for me to address everything I feel should be a priority for individuals and families in just a few minutes, but I'm going to just try to hit on a few key points before asking some questions. I believe, and I've said this many times, that a lasting tax reform needs to be bipartisan and it needs to be comprehensive, and I would strongly caution against a go-it-alone strategy that seems to have taken a hold of tax reform for the time being. Lasting tax reform must be bipartisan. History is not on the side of going it alone. Tax reform also cannot be balanced on the backs of the middle class, who already feel like they're being squeezed from all directions. So far, the plans and tweets that I've seen from the House Republicans and the President would result in an astronomical tax cut to the tune of $1.3 million per wealthy household. The people that I represent in Southern California, which the majority are hardworking middle-class families and individuals, would receive roughly 70 cents per day under these plans. And I'm sorry, but 70 cents a day is not going to help those families to better afford child care, elder care, plan for their retirement, or even take a small family vacation. Mr. Rodriguez, I'd like to turn to some points you raised in your testimony. As we know, the young, growing Latino population in this country is going to make up roughly a third of the U.S. workforce in the next decade. This is a population that has unique concerns within our tax code, but they also face the exact same barriers as other working families across the country. Given the younger age of this population, many of them have not even entered the years when child care and elder care expenses are going to become some of the largest burdens and challenges that they face. One of the principles that you highlighted in your written testimony was the need to support working families and children while also reducing poverty. Can you elaborate a bit more on the need for the tax code to address child and family care expenses in a meaningful way?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. It's exactly right. I think that the most effective anti-poverty program we have right now is the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, the refundable portion. And I know that's a bad word before some in the committee, but it's enormously important. And 20 million families receive these credits, and it helps to lift 9 million families above the poverty level every year. These are working families raising children. And so finding ways, looking at the population that is young, hardworking, raising families, and providing and targeting better benefits or incentives and tax incentives to this group who's beginning to either save for retirement or buying homes or doing the kinds of things that are living the American dream, but need more opportunities to do so, and the tax code can do that. So if we can find more ways to do that, certainly some of the other elements, education is key, child care is also very, very key. There's a number of different ways that the tax code can assist these families directly.
Thank you. With respect to the EITC, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, that is a tax credit for middle and working class families. I feel like the rhetoric surrounding EITC paints it as just a handout. And can you explain why that's a wrong way to characterize the EITC?
Yeah, absolutely. These are all working families working very hard, but just happen to be working for low wages. And even in accumulated households don't reach the threshold level to be able to pay federal tax liability, but they pay payroll taxes, they pay into local and state taxes, they pay sales taxes in places, and they're burdened by these taxes. So the earned income credits and the refundable child tax credit is an important way to assist these families. Refunds go to, buying a car. It helps you go to work, or paying off bills, or doing very, very important things that also generate economic activity in all of the communities across the country that many of the members of the committee represent.
And in the final seconds, can you please tell me what would be the outcome of our tax code and doing a tax reform that only it gives a majority of the tax cut benefit to the very wealthy? What will that mean for
My
our
biggest
country?
concern, thank you, Congresswoman, I mentioned that the wealth gap right now between Latinos and non-Latinos white households is 10 to 1 on the dollar. My worry is that that grows to 15 to 1, to 20 to 1, with increasing incentives for those at the very top of the wealth scale. When we eliminate inheritance taxes, when we look at the pass-through taxes, and we're just giving those tax breaks to a very small number of very wealthy households getting large tax cuts, my worry is that that increases those disparities when we're having conversations about narrowing and improving equality across the board.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Holding.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel for all of your testimony today. I'm particularly pleased to see Chairman Archer. The chairman served with my predecessor on this committee, Jim Martin. Of course, there was a 30-year gap between his service and my service on the committee, but I'm pleased to see Chairman Archer, and when I see former Governor Martin in North Carolina next month, I'll give him your regards. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this hearing. Over the past number of hearings we've had, we've discussed in detail the importance of leveling the playing field and ensuring that businesses have a tax code that will allow them to compete here at home and around the globe. And I strongly believe that this fairness in the tax code is just as important to individuals, our citizens, as it is to our companies. Some examples of unfairnesses in the code to individuals, I'll illuminate two. First is the alternative minimum tax, which was implemented 50 years ago, was put in place to address a small number of people who are paying no federal income tax due to certain tax-preferred vehicles. But today, it's clear that this provision no longer addresses the original intent of the law and instead creates an unnecessary and costly burden that outweighs the benefit of the provision. Similarly, another provision, our current system of citizenship-based taxation, which was implemented during the Civil War as a means to discourage wealthy Americans from fleeing the country and thus depleting necessary wartime coffers. Today, this burdensome regime of citizenship-based taxation has led to record-high expatriations and hampered the ability of our citizens to compete for jobs across the globe. Amazingly, it costs up to 40% more to hire American citizens abroad in many foreign jurisdictions. And so this section unfairly disadvantages our citizens and discourages American multinational companies from hiring Americans to run their international operations. And it also discourages foreign multinationals from hiring Americans to run their operations. So while moving to a territorial system for corporations is an integral part of our blueprint and a necessary part of tax reform, the competitive disadvantage will only become more apparent and grow if we fail to move to a residency-based taxation for individuals. So these are two examples that we have the opportunity to address on the individual level to have a fair tax reform plan for individuals as well as for corporations. Another element that maybe I could get some comment on has to do with compliance. The United States has a relatively high rate of voluntary compliance when it comes to individuals filing their tax returns. But as the tax system has gotten more complex, more and more individuals have to turn to professionals, tax preparers to help with their returns. So, I believe that simplifying the tax code will preserve our tradition of voluntary compliance. And Chairman Archer, do you have any comment on that, perhaps?
Well, needless to say, for one who continued to do his own tax return, simplification has a lot of appeal to me. And I think that it probably, for most individuals, may be one of the major concerns that people have. But again, politically, it is not simple to get simplification. It's something that has been out there looming as an attraction for members of this committee for as long as I can remember. But in the end, we always seem to make it more complicated because the tax code has been used by so many people on the outside as a means of making whatever they want to occur happen in the country. And it's been used, in my opinion, far too much. And I feel that way about tax credits. The use of tax credits to me is not the purpose of the code. The code is primarily designed to raise the money to pay the government's bills and not to create all of these complexities.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Chairman Archer, thank you, and thanks for your previous service to this institution. And I, too, want to thank you for bringing up the issue of retroactivity. And this committee has talked a number of times over the years as to repealing of LIFO, and doing that retroactively would just be a monster for people who have used that tax provision to deal with. I appreciate you bringing that up. And Ms. Stout, I want to second Mr. Doggett's comments on your bringing up the issue of workplace savings and retirement accounts. If we did nothing else in this Congress but provided a means by which people could save while they're working for their retirement years, it would mean so much for retirement security. That would be an excellent outcome. When we're talking about tax reform, a couple of things that are really important to me. One is that whatever we do is paid for. I don't think we can afford to charge our kids and our grandkids with tax cuts that we give out today. And I think we have to insist on making sure that any reform that we do is in fact reform, not just an unpaid for tax cut. And we also have to focus, I agree with some of my other colleagues have mentioned this, focus on middle and working class individuals. This is a group of people in this country who have really been left behind. And we need to figure out how we can incentivize their being able to get ahead and make more money. And I think one area of doing that is to understand the importance of furthering education. Greater education, and all types of education, higher education, career training, low-tech training, whatever it might be, all of that is value added. The more that you have, the rule is the more that you make. And we need to figure out how to help people make more money and get better jobs and get the jobs that people want. So I would really hope that we are able to focus on those types of things in our effort. It needs to be about the American people, and the American people who don't have lobbyists working for them on a day-to-day basis, and the American people who haven't been able to take advantage of this tax code that the chairman referenced as being used to help everybody under the sun but them. Mr. Rodriguez, I want to follow up on what Ms. Sanchez talked about, because it ties in with my concern about paying for whatever it is we do in this tax reform. In the past, you know, we've been down this road before. We've seen this movie before. We do big tax cuts, and then we just pass the bill on to somebody else. We have a budget, it's been referenced already today, that is focused on cutting important aspects of our health care in order to pay for, or to eventually pay for tax cuts or tax reform. Can you tell me how cuts to Medicare or Medicaid will help working class people?
They don't. We have a more recent example, too, in the Kansas experiment of how this really doesn't work and puts enormous pressure on states to be able to provide adequate funding for services like education and workforce and programs that you mentioned that are enormously important to growth and economic mobility in those communities. Look no further than that to show you how this kind of approach to our budget and taxing system is wrong-headed.
Kansas was so bad that they had to repeal what they had done.
That's correct.
And the Republican legislature recognized that to the point where they overrode the Republican governor's veto of that repeal. It was devastating to people in that state.
Absolutely, and if you look at the current budget resolution proposal, or you look at the Trump budget as an example, you can see massive amounts of cuts to programs assumed, $1.3 trillion, and the non-defense discretionary programs. That'll put enormous pressure on all of these program areas. And you're right, in the health care bill, we saw $500 billion or so in tax cuts, and of course, $800 billion.
I'm fast running out of time, but if
Medicaid.
you would, I'd like to hear from you, or you can submit it in writing. I'd like to see a list of tax reform that you think would help middle and working class individuals.
Happy to do that.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. T-Berry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this meeting. And Mr. Archer, thank you for being here and for your service to our country. The reason I love to be on this wonderful panel is because my colleagues always remind me why I became a Republican on my left. And they've heard this story before about my dad when I was 16 years old and took my first job at McDonald's. And my dad went through all the different taxes that got taken out of my check and said, don't let the tax code change your behavior. You need to save money, and you need to continue to work hard and make more money and get a good job. And today, when I was a realtor, and Mr. Rodriguez, you mentioned this and kind of got me thinking again, because I looked at your bio, and a very good bio. But what was amazing to me, I never realized this until I started my own business. First time in my life that I had to send a check to the IRS every quarter, which is very different than being a congressman or working for a congresswoman or a congressman or working at a think tank, because you put it all on the line and you're actually sending that check to the IRS. Now, what's fascinating to me is today, you mentioned pass-throughs. Today, if you're a successful pass-through, and no one is going to guarantee that you're a successful business owner, in America, you're paying almost 45% of what you make at the top bracket just to the federal government. That doesn't include what you pay to the state in income taxes. That doesn't include what you pay to your local government in income taxes. That doesn't include workers' comp. That doesn't include anything else that our 3 levels of government are requiring of you. So I take issue with the fact that as a pass-through, getting a tax cut is not appropriate. And I learned that from my immigrant father, who's worked hard his entire life, retired now, who always complained about the taxes he paid. With a 6th grade education, as a steelworker, never making a lot of money. What great street smarts, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stout, your written testimony was fabulous when I read it. You wrote about simplification and consolidation, and you concluded that one does not necessarily equal the other, which I thought was really interesting. And you specifically mentioned the different kinds of employer savings plans, like 401k and 403b and 457 plans. And I've heard from a number of participants, including teachers and firefighters from my district. And in my district, in Columbus, Ohio, Nationwide Insurance is the largest provider of 457 plans in the country. So can you provide some more detail on the different populations that these plans serve, and why it's important for us to, in considering tax reform, to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and continue to allow for the incentivizing of these plans for people to save?
Yes, thank you, Congressman Taberi. As far as the need, there is a need out there to have different types of plans, and we still have a need to keep them and simplify them. But as far as to answer your question directly as to the different employers that are served by the different plans, it depends on what type of plan they want. If it's a small employer, they might institute a simple 401k or a simple IRA versus, the mid-sized companies might do a 401k. The nonprofit world has 403b plans, and then in the governmental side, the 457. So, there are different nuances to each of those plans that solve for the needs of those different industries and those different groups. I think that we still need to keep them, work at simplifying things, but I don't think that, one plan solves for everyone.
Mr. Rodriguez mentioned in his testimony that we should better target middle and lower income folks for incentives, and I agree with that. But I found in your testimony what was fascinating is that, and let me get this right, that the largest groups benefiting from 401k plans are employees who earn less than $50,000 a year. In the last administration, they worked to cap that amount of money that an employee could put in.
Right.
Could that actually disincentivize employers from providing those plans and thus benefiting those workers that me and Mr. Rodriguez want to help?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It would have a huge impact if we took away the incentives of small businesses offering these plans. They need those incentives to get them to the table to even put the plan in place. We have a coverage issue, so we don't want to put anything in the way of getting the small business owner to put that plan out there to help their workers.
Ms. Del Bene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today. Mr. Rodriguez, I'm coming here today from a budget markup where we've been debating disastrous cuts to critical investments in education, in infrastructure, workforce training programs, and healthcare. And so I appreciate the reminder in your testimony that when we talk about tax reform, we should remember that first and foremost, we need to have the revenues to pay for these basic government functions that serve as the foundations for growing a strong and a resilient middle class. Yet somehow over the years, we've moved away from this simple concept, and the code has morphed into something of a monstrosity with layers of complexity that always seem to benefit the wealthiest few, while everyone else is left to wonder how they keep getting left behind here in Washington. Mr. Rodriguez, the Tax Policy Center has estimated that under the Republican blueprint, the wealthiest taxpayers would see an average tax cut of over $1 million, while middle-class families would get around $200. And the Trump plan offers middle-class families a paltry 0.1% of the $1.4 million cut the richest Americans could expect to see. So at a time when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem bent on gutting funding for education, healthcare, and other critical resources for working families, do you think that even $200 per family is anywhere near enough to make up for what Republicans want to take away in terms of healthcare or education resources?
No, not at all. And it's a huge issue. We, of course, do a lot of work in all of those areas between job training, education, and healthcare. And we know there are great needs and resource needs that are there. So we're enormously concerned about that.
Thank you. Chairman Archer, thank you so much for being with us today. I imagine you know firsthand how elusive comprehensive tax reform can be. And I agree with many of the things that you said in your testimony, that tax reform should not be corporate only, that it should be permanent to give people some ability to plan for the future, and that progress is achievable this Congress. But there was one word that was conspicuously absent from your testimony, and that word was bipartisanship. And I believe without bipartisanship that this committee will never achieve any of the laudable goals that you outlined. And I wonder, do you agree with that?
I certainly believe that it's desirable to have bipartisanship, particularly on something that is as important as fundamental tax reform. It seems to me, as with health care reform, both parties should be a part of it. Otherwise, it seems to me that it is not going to be as long-lasting as it should be.
And as you know, I'm new to the committee, but I've done some homework, and the 1986 tax reform process was far more extensive than what the committee has done this year. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 was preceded by 30 days of full committee hearings on tax reform, 5 hearings in the Select Revenue Measures Subcommittee, and 3 hearings in the Oversight Subcommittee, and a full 26 days of markup between September 18th, 1985 and December 3rd, 1985. And the Senate Finance Committee put in the hard work as well, 36 days of full committee public hearings and 6 subcommittee hearings and 17 days of markup. And that's a far cry from what we're hearing now from Finance Chairman Hatch, who just yesterday said that the Finance Committee may not have a single hearing on tax reform this year. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record the legislative history of the 1986 Tax Reform Act, with your permission.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Chairman Archer, do you think that the committee and Congress as a whole conducted a deliberative examination of revenue issues in the 1986 tax reform?
Well, clearly, the 86 tax reform took a lot of time to put together. And in the end, it prevailed with some very hard-hitting pressures from the top, on both sides, I must say. I was very concerned, as I mentioned earlier today, with the fact that there was retroactivity in there that was going to undermine the value of real estate. And it was put in there, of course, to get extra revenue. And it disturbed me enough that I wanted to offer a motion to recommit with instructions. And I am convinced that I had the votes to beat the bill if I had been permitted to offer that motion to recommit with instructions. Unfortunately, and I mentioned that there was a lot of pressure from the top, the ranking Republican in the House was called by the White House and told that he could not let me offer the motion to recommit with instructions. And called me into his office and told me that he was going to have to personally take it away from me. There wasn't anything I could do. The power was there. It was unprecedented because the ranking Republican on the committee was for the bill, so he had taken himself out of the process. I was a second ranking, and traditionally I should have been given the motion to recommit. So those things were going on behind the scenes. And in addition, of course, you not only had the president who signed on, but you had the chairman of the committee, who was then a Democrat, who was totally committed to it. And the pressure that he put on in the committee was pretty incredible, too. So you had bipartisanship, but bipartisanship, in my view, did not produce a bill that was in the best interest of the country.
Thank you. My time's
but
expired.
That was my own prejudice, you understand.
Mr. Marchant.
See ya.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I go around my district and talk about tax reform, the thing that I hold up at most of the meetings is this postcard. And believe it or not, this postcard is much more popular than the IRS code as it exists. People are intrigued by it. I can't say that they read every single line of it and make calculations in their head on the spot. But the biggest question that I do get in my district about this postcard is, can I fill the postcard out if I file the alternative minimum tax? And I say there's not going to be, in our plan, there is not going to be an alternative minimum tax. So for a great percentage of people in my district, probably the most frustrating part of the tax code is, in fact, the fact that they have to figure their taxes twice. They figure the first go around, and then, of course, they have to go through it again to see if they owe this other tax. What kind of effect, Mr. Archer, Mr. McKay, what kind of effect does that have on taxpayers when they physically usually cannot fill it out simply for that reason?
Congressman Marchant, I have always been in opposition to the alternative minimum tax. It made no sense. It was not good tax policy. And in the end, had it continued to be in place without change, it would have generated more income tax revenue than the regular income tax. And to me, that did not make any sense. So I think you're absolutely right. I hope you can do away with the alternative minimum tax. And if you do, you will do a service for the country.
Mr. McKay.
Thank you, Congressman. Complexity in the tax code comes in many forms. I mentioned before, there's a half a dozen different definitions of the term dependent. There are more opportunities for simplifying the tax code than there'd probably be room for in the eventual tax bill that comes out of Congress. Whatever Congress decides about any particular provision, like the alternative minimum tax or any other provision, our point of view is we will, as an industry, both technology and professional practitioners, show up and serve to simplify people's experience. The postcard is something that this industry is well prepared to deliver for the taxpayer. We mentioned before, it ought to be electronic, but an electronic postcard can be a vastly simplified way of complying. There's a security issue in terms of a piece of paper that goes into a mailbox and so on. But it's actually a more interesting issue, and that is, I mentioned before, the 98 Act that led the way to converting the country to electronic filing. In the course of all that, IRS eliminated from its budget the overwhelming number of paper processing plants, the system of the old days of how paper returns were processed. But there was a huge advantage for the country in it. Putting a paper return into that system, and the IRS employees would key in key fields from the return, produced about a 20% error rate, whether the error was the original taxpayer or in the keying in of abstracts, about a 20% rate, studies said back then. Moving to an electronic filing system, that dropped to a 1% to 2% rate of error. So there's real advantage in electronic implementation, but whatever the provisions of the code are that you all decide as our policymakers, the ability to simplify that, whether it's in an electronic postcard or any of the other tools that are available, including for simple returns, people can do it now on a phone with an app. You take a picture of a W-2 and very quickly have a return brought in. So the private sector will bring the tools of innovation to this so that this will have the vision, realize the vision that you on the committee and in the Congress choose as tax policy.
Thank you, Mr. McKay.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I want to thank all the witnesses and join in the accolades for Chairman Archer for his service here. And I like to say from the outset, Mr. Chairman, that I never tire of listening to the story by Pat Tiberi of his immigrant parents. And because actually, you know, on this committee, there are so many stories to be told that make up the fabric of this nation and what we're all about. And I would like to say that in echoing Mr. Doggett's comments, that we do need to have more hearings. And frankly, we need more stories like Mr. T. Berry's so that we can actually get to the gut of what we need to do in terms of tax reform and why we may have our disagreements and procedures, and that would allow me the opportunity to quote my Irish grandfather who would say, well, you know, trust everyone, but cut the cards, because oftentimes you may need a reshuffle, and in some cases, as Mr. Roosevelt said, a new deal. And oftentimes it's the vagaries of society that leave government in a position where we have to do things. Ms. Stout, I was specifically aligned with a lot of your comments because I do think we have to provide greater opportunities for people to save. And in doing so, I do support a number of the issues, and Mr. T. Berry talked about pass-throughs, et cetera. I think the way that we have to look at this is where can we assist and help people save? Well, we do have a prime example of that. I ran an insurance agency. I know what it's like to meet a payroll. I was trained at an insurance school where we learned about investment and where we always said there were 3 legs on the stool, right? And one of those legs was Social Security. So at the same time we're talking about enhancing benefits and the opportunity to save, shouldn't we be talking about something that hasn't been touched since Mr. Archer was the chairman in terms of enhancing the opportunity for people to benefit from a system that has never missed a payment? But when's the last time there was actuarially an increase in the Social Security program? It was indexed back in 1983, and it hasn't been able to keep pace. It's an insurance program. It's not an entitlement. It's an insurance program. Have any of your premiums in insurance gone up since 1983? Yes, of course they have, and everybody would acknowledge that. So I think we have to, because what we saw what can happen, as my grandfather was alluding to, and trust everyone but cut the cards, all of a sudden in 2008, your 401k became a 101k. And without having that counterbalance, which is why we need more hearings like this, the counterbalance of knowing that there is a safety net, that there is a floor, which you also have to contribute to and save for and participate in, but that in the event of taking risk, that your government stands behind you. That was the lesson of the Great Depression, and I believe the lesson of 2008 as well. What other plans would you recommend, Ms. Stout, that we could be using? And would you agree with that assessment about making sure that that third leg on the stool is balanced as well as the others?
Thank you, Congressman Larson. I think absolutely both are important, Social Security as well as saving for yourself, whether in an employer-sponsored plan. I think that, you know, Working America is looking for ways to, whether it's incentives or education on how to save. So we've got to make it simple for them. I work with thousands, I've worked in my 20 years with thousands of working Americans, and, you know, they're struggling with, you know, figuring out their finances and how to put away some extra money. So I think both programs are important. You've got to have that 3-legged stool. As far as other programs, I think a big focus should be on coverage and making it simple for employers to offer these plans.
Mr. Rodriguez?
Absolutely. I think it's both a combination of greater access, also making it easier to save, but also improving the incentives for people to save as much as we possibly can for those target populations that are not saving but could do some more.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Johnson, the chairman of the Social Security Committee, who has agreed to have hearings on this where we can put these plans out there, and I think that will only enhance both opportunities governmentally and also some from the private sector. We need both.
Mr. Curbelo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the panel, and I especially want to thank Chairman Archer for his participation and for his service to our country. I also want to associate myself with some of my colleagues who have emphasized the importance that tax reform has for America's working families. There's obviously a great deal of frustration in this country. We see it play out in our politics. We see it play out on social media on an hourly basis. And I really think that tax reform is a solution, an instrument that can help address some of that economic insecurity that so many Americans feel. And I think we do have to put ourselves in the position of that family that maybe has 2 or 3 kids and has to pick them up from school, take them to school, take them to practice, and then once a year go through this difficult exercise of complying with the federal government and the IRS. So I want to focus briefly on the complexity of the tax code. Mr. Chairman, the Tax Foundation estimates that in 2016, Americans spent over 2.6 billion hours compiling tax returns, the cost of almost $100 billion. Again, that is time and money which could have been used for productive economic activity, or better yet, time spent with family. So as we take on this task of comprehensive tax reform, Mr. McKay, I want to ask you the complexity of the tax system, where a lot of Americans have to turn to professional tax preparers to file their returns. In recent years, Preparer Fraud has consistently listed among the IRS's dirty dozen of tax scams. I've been supportive of the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program, where those who make less than $54,000 a year can file their returns with the help of an IRS-certified volunteer. Can you talk about how increasing the standard deduction will reduce the dependence that so many Americans have on professional tax preparers?
Professional tax preparers provide a variety of functions. It's interesting, the National Taxpayer Advocate about a decade ago at a conference on tax reform talked about exactly as you say, the one time a year when the average family takes stock of their financial situation, which is the moment of tax compliance. And she characterized it at the time as a national ritual that she felt there was actually some benefit from, because if people didn't take a hard look at their own finances then, most families would never look at them at all year. And so then the question really becomes the simplification of the experience, that it is less painful, less burdensome, less costly. The industry has worked very hard to create options, and it's an intensely competitive industry with a lot of innovation. Tax services come in a lot of forms, everything from professional tax practitioners to accountants to tax attorneys to do-it-yourself software. There is a growing sense, I think, not only in the industry but from the taxpayers we serve, that they need practical, common sense simplification so that they can make financial decisions about what to do in the coming year for their family rather than come away confused and struggling. I would mention there's actually a couple of programs, the two largest ones that are supported and sponsored by the government are indeed the VITA centers all across this country. And there's somewhere in the area of about 2.5 million or a little more of returns prepared for free there every year. There is also the IRS Free File program, which is service donation by a large number of different companies through the IRS website under IRS regulation and consumer protection rules. That also creates about 2.5 million returns. Between the two programs, somewhere between 5 and 6 million returns are generated for free, in one instance in volunteer service centers within communities and neighborhoods, in the other online that you can access through your phone or through a computer. And between the two, you have significant help at no cost for lower and middle income people. And it's a unique American invention. So many other countries, government does the whole thing as a revenue collection process with no involvement of the citizen. So the ideal situation would be to simplify, to improve the taxpayers' understanding of their own taxation and enabling them to make better financial decisions for their future, and at the same time take advantage of the capabilities of both tax professionals and tax technology innovations to make it simpler and easier for folks. That's why I said before, if you decide to have a postcard-style tax return, that this industry will deliver that robustly so that it will be something that people have confidence in. And in all likelihood, having that electronic will also add security protections and easy access for people to use.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKay.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the panel, Mr. Archer, Mr. McKay, Ms. Stout, Mr. Rodriguez. Thank you all for your time and your insight. I know I've benefited from comments that each one of you have had, and you bring an expertise and a wealth of experience to the subcommittee, and we really, really appreciate it. Let me try and just make some closing observations and comments, if I could, as a prerogative. First, on process, Ms. Sanchez said that history is not on the side of going it alone, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. I'm not trying to pile on, but my view is the ACA was an example of how not to do things, and so I think we're going to be better off if we try and create a bipartisan approach to this, and there's probably no argument there. Another process point I think is important to make, and that is there's a temptation to evaluate tax reform discussions sort of in a very finite period of time, but I think the committee should get credit for some of the hearings that took place on the Camp draft, similar themes that have come up, and there's been nearly 50 hearings in recent years on tax reform generally. And my assumption is now that we will see an increasing amount of activity the closer we get to a final product. I think that there's also been some discussion about Kansas. This came up last week, and it came up this week as well. And I think there's a lesson for us on Kansas, and that's this. Don't allow a special provision, to create essentially a trap door for pass-throughs, essentially. So there was a pass-through exemption that was allowed, and it didn't happen on the corporate side. And so what happened? You have a system that gets gamed, and ultimate activity doesn't result come out of that. What we're proposing is not to do that, and we're proposing to lower the rates similarly for pass-throughs and corporations, C-corps, at the same level. Speaking of states, I come from the state of what not to do. The state of Illinois has an underlying fiscal mess, a complete disaster. Rather than dealing with the underlying things that are driving it, my state legislature, over the governor's objection, said, hey, let's raise taxes. And here's the net effect. People are leaving Illinois. They're going to Wisconsin, they're going to Indiana, they're going to all the other attractive Midwestern states like Ohio, and because they've done a better job. And so that's an example. That's a cautionary tale for us on what not to do. The VITA centers that Mr. Curbelo mentioned, I think, provide real insight. I attended one. I visited a couple of them in my constituency, most recently in West Chicago, Illinois, at a high school or at a middle school there. Going in and talking to the volunteers, he gained real insight on this issue of complexity. So if you're in a situation where you're visiting a VITA site, you're sitting down, and I was asking some of the volunteers, what's your average interview time for talking to someone? And these are very modestly, situated people. And they said, about 90 minutes. Now imagine that, going through the hassle of 90 minutes, talking to some volunteer, backing and forthing, and so forth, finally to come up with something, and all this level of complexity that nobody up here, interestingly, is defending, and nobody at the witness panel is defending, and yet that's what this very constituency is burdened with. I think that there's also an interesting observation that I'd like to make. If this yielded 70 cents a day, if that was the bottom line, if that was really the number, no, I wouldn't defend it. 70 cents a day per family, I don't think that's really where the action is. The Tax Foundation came up with a study, and I'd ask unanimous consent to put this into the record. The Tax Foundation has, their study shows that there's an increase in 1,687,000 jobs, full-time equivalents, and an estimated gain of wait for it, $4,917 in after-tax income for median households throughout the U.S. In my home state, $5,256. In Ms. Sanchez's home state, who raised this question, even more than that, $5,536. So that will be part of the record. There's also an interesting thing as it relates to your testimony, Mr. Rodriguez, and I'm not asking you to comment, but it's just an observation that I had, and that's this. A few years ago, I had a meeting with one of the presidents of one of the large Hispanic business organizations. And I think I remember the one it was. I don't want to say it out loud because then if I'm wrong, it's so forth. But he came in and he said something to me which is really interesting, and it made a big impact on me. He said, we're against the estate tax. We're against the death tax. I said, really? That's not what I would have expected you to be talking to me about. And he said, yeah, here's why. For the first time ever, Hispanic families are making serious money in this country. Not all of them, by any stretch of the imagination. But he said, why is it when Hispanic families are making money that there's an estate tax? Where was the estate tax 100 years ago when other families were making all their money? And I just leave it at there. It's a very provocative question, particularly coming from somebody who heads a business organization. In order for us to get to this bipartisan approach, we've got to settle out an underlying tension. And it's a tension that surfaces occasionally, and you heard a little bit of it today. And the question is, do we view the economy as a zero-sum game? Do we view that pie as expanding, where people benefit? Or do we view it as something that if someone benefits, then that comes at someone else's expense? There was a subtext throughout a lot of the discussion, a lot of the questions, and so forth. I personally reject the notion that it is a zero-sum game. And Mr. Teaberry, in his observation, was talking about, you know, the tax burden that's out there. We're not going to settle that today, but it is a question that really has to be wrestled with. And we've got to come to essentially a world view about it. Because if all this is a matter of redistribution, then that's one thing. But I think everybody is here saying, no, that's not what we want alone. We want to make sure that there's growth here. And growth comes if we do this the right way. I think we need to explore a great deal more, Ms. Stout, about what you were talking about, credits on encouraging auto enrollment, for example. That would be something very, very interesting. And I think to get back to one of Mr. Rodriguez's key points, this notion of savers getting tapped out at such a low level with very low headroom and very little capacity for them to save, that's something that I think we can vastly improve. And when push comes to shove, this postcard is so attractive and so enticing. And I go back to this theme in many other discussions. Think about the premium that we put on simplicity in other elements of our lives. Just think about that for a second. We want to go through TSA PreCheck. We want to go through the Easy Pass lanes on the tollways. We want to go through the 15 items or less lane, you know, and we'll at the grocery store. We want an expedited process. I mentioned this, my expectation of the airlines app and so forth. We expect this in all aspects of our lives, and yet the one thing that has an impact on every single bit of the economy, the Internal Revenue Code, is cumbersome to the point of absurdity. So I think what we've settled here today is nobody likes where we are. Everybody wants to move somewhere else, and what we've got to do is sort out among us how it is that we do that. But on behalf of our entire committee, I want to thank each one of you for your willingness to spend time with us this afternoon, and I thank my colleagues, particularly these two brothers, for sticking it out to the end. The committee's adjourned.
Nice job, Chairman.
Nervous there? That's good. Yeah, that's all right. Well, yeah, sure. Do you want to go try to let's go down. Sir, do you have anything? Why don't you take that back? Thank you, sir. Yeah, we're good. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Peter.
Enjoyed it. Yeah,
See you
thank
soon.
you. Thanks, guys. Appreciate your help.